They're not legal to be sold in the UK and they shouldn't be fitted. So that's obviously a van in habitation mode. Let's be honest here, it is extremely controversial. Well, it's certainly getting colder and you're going to be needing to heat your van. And your first thought might be, which heater should I buy? Diesel, gas, maybe wood, or simply just an electric one. It's really best to think it through properly to avoid the mistakes that can be easily made. You know, before you start spending a penny, before you drill a single hole in your van, ask yourself a few of these questions. You know, when are you going to be using your van? What will the temperatures you're going to be experiencing be like when you are using it? Will you be always on hookup, or are you going to be going off-grid, adventure style? What's going to be your budget? And do you really need to heat the space? Or could you just get away with just heating the person? Because answering those questions honestly could be the difference between tens of pounds or thousands of pounds. You know, we don't want to be wasting money, nor do we want to make a mistake of buying something that could be dangerous, illegal, or simply not effective enough for our needs. I will discuss some essentials which you're also going to need too. In fact, they're actually must-haves. Now, one of the first things that some people might think is, I'll just get a simple electric heater and I'll be running it off my leisure battery or maybe my portable power station. They're only cheap. How much is this one? I don't know, I think they go for like about 20, 40 quid or something like that. And yet they are popular. You've got the camper, whatever this one is, and then you've got the camper Diddy, the camper Q-Boy, but they do start at power outputs from 750 watt. So even on that lowest power, it's going to be eating through your battery in absolutely no time at all if you're leaving it on constantly. Now, I do know that some of you will actually use these, but that's just to take the chill off. But that's when the questions I've raised kind of come in. You know, if you're going to be down to minus temperatures, then this would have to be on for a reasonable amount of time. And now your battery may last the night, but what are you going to do for power in the morning? And also, how will you recharge that battery the next day? You might say you've got solar, but if you're off grid and not actually under the sun, or it is in the winter temperatures, you know, if you're in the trees and you've got no sunlight, then you're not going to be getting much solar power. You know, you just have to think about it. Now, unless you're on hookup or have a significant power source, then electric fan heaters might not be the best choice for most current camper vans. And that same logic applies to the other electrical options, like underfloor heating. Now, this is just a bit of a luxury. It is not a primary source of heat. You know, it's brilliant for using, you know, when you've been out of that shower or you've come in from the cold and you can get your feet nice and toasty. But it doesn't heat that space. You know, it is a luxury. It's not going to be your primary source of heating. But when I said current camper vans, and that's because technology is improving all the time. There are electric heaters currently in development to be specifically used for camper vans. Now, at the NEC show, I did show you one of the vans which can utilize the vehicle's traction battery. So that 13 kilowatt hour, I think it is, for heating and cooking, that's a big battery. So in the future, you know, maybe something like that could be a little bit more appropriate. But for now, your leisure battery or your portable power station, it's not really going to last a long time for most vehicles. More on that in the future. But for now, your leisure battery or your portable power station can easily run a heated sleeping bag or perhaps a heated blanket. But this is heat the person, not the space strategy. Like I showed you last year, I did a video on this where I had a heated sleeping bag and I powered it by a power station. But equally, you can actually do this by using a portable battery pack thing, because they don't draw an awful lot of power. One of those power banks is just slim enough to actually sit inside the pocket, and you can run it all night long on a decent battery, and you're going to be perfectly warm for bed. So for many people, especially a solo camper or maybe just a weekend camper, it's a decent solution. It is cheaper, it's silent, and it's more efficient when you are just using one of those smaller battery banks. But what if you want to heat the space? What if you want to sit in a t-shirt while it's snowing outside? What if you had kids or pets, or maybe just other people who want to be keeping warm? You know, that's when you're going to be needing a proper heater, an installed space heater. And that's where there's lots more choices and lots more questions to ask yourself. And it brings us on to one of the most critical parts of this video, and that's getting the safety and the insulation right. installation, not insulation, although insulation, as far as I'm concerned, is very, very important. But more on that coming up in the future, because actually, yeah, I'll leave that. But yeah, there is something big coming on that in the future. But getting the safety and the installation right, you know, it isn't optional. This is the part that keeps you and your van safe. Getting it wrong really is not an option. So number one, as far as this is concerned, and that is a carbon monoxide alarm. It is absolutely essential. You know, it's not a theoretical risk, it's an actual risk. You know, we've got them in our homes, so there's no reason not to have one in our camper vans. And that also goes for a smoke alarm as well. You know, these are both essential items, as is the next one. You know, a fire extinguisher. It's non-negotiable. You know, you're using a fuel burning appliance and you're also doing some cooking as well. You know, there is a potential risk. I've spoken about the placement of them before. You know, if you are going to be doing your cooking in your van, then you don't want this in the back of your van. You want it near where the cooking appliances are. But yeah, do have a look at back at that video for more information on that. But it's just kind of common sense, really. You know, if you're cooking, you've got a heat source. That's where your fire extinguishing appliance should be, and obviously fire blanket or whatever else you've got as well. You know, to be honest with you, I have seen more people with more than one. You know, some people do have one in the cooker and then they've got one in the back as well. Some people like to keep one in the glove box, one of the kind of smaller ones, one of the 5-in-1s. But yeah, as long as you've at least got one near your main risk, then that's kind of all we can really have. But you know, they're not particularly expensive. And at the end of the day, you've got quite a few £1,000s of van, you know, and a simple device such as that might help you maintain that van. But the next thing is ventilation. Now, all combustion heaters, gas or diesel, they do burn fuel, they produce exhaust. And that exhaust must obviously go outside. And also the heater needs to have a fresh air supply to burn. And on top of that, you need fresh air to breathe. So you need to have adequate ventilation. If you fit in a gas appliance, fixed ventilation is required. Your pop top should be raised in habitation mode. In fact, let's go and have a look at a pop top, because this always should have a vent at the top. Let's go have a walk over there. So that's obviously a van in habitation mode. The pop top is up. But what you will also notice, and this is a requirement, is it's got a vent at the very, very top. So you've got the window, and then above that, you've got that vent. And that's obviously for a high level vent. Now also what you have is other vents, which I'll show you inside. There should be various different vents throughout the van. And in here, you can see a vent there, and that is unrestricted from the gas hob. If you've got a gas locker, which this van's not got because it is actually an underslung tank, then the gas locker should also have a vent. And also an extra vent, which is generally by the NCC. Well, it's actually an NCC thing, and you need an extra dropout vent at the lowest point, and you'll often find that on the passenger side there. So that's what that one is, not to be confused with the air intake for the diesel heater, or the outlet for that matter, which you can see is tucked away out the side. But yeah, there's actually something on that which I'll be bringing you again in a future video. Yeah, that video actually, to be honest with you, it does feature some crazy things, because some conversion companies, or converters shall we say, some of their aftermarket things, some of them are quite bizarre, quite frankly unbelievable. So I do have a video on that coming soon. So yeah, do subscribe if you want to see that, and obviously other related campervan videos. But as far as the safety is concerned, you know, one thing is, if you fit in a gas appliance, you know, it really isn't a DIY job. It should be left to the professionals. You know, somebody who is got a qualified engineer. You know, it's actually something that can affect your insurance policy. So yeah, so you might want to check that if you are doing a DIY install, just to see if your insurer is actually going to cover it. On the other hand though, diesel heater installations, you know, are attempted by competent DIYers. And if it's been done right, then it's absolutely brilliant. But there is still a risk of poor insulation or poor product. You know, and this is why we have to talk about the cheap diesel heaters. You know, let's be honest here, it is extremely controversial. You know, but when it comes to the heaters, you know, you see one for 100 quid and then you see one for 1,500 quid. You know, what is the difference? Well, many of those unbranded heaters are illegal to sell in the UK. Trading standards have seized and destroyed thousands of them. But why? They've not had valid CE markings, and I say valid CE markings. There's no manufacturer address and dangerously vague installation instructions, which can miss critical safety details. But don't get me wrong, this isn't broad brush that they're all bad. This isn't the case. I'm not actually saying that. But there are some available that are cheap and very, very nasty. They're not legal to be sold in the UK, and they shouldn't be fitted. You do have to look very carefully, do your proper research. However, some of these cheap heaters may be okay, and I'm sure many people have fitted them and they will tell you that they're absolutely fine, which is great. But with many of these units, it's the fact that they haven't been tested, they haven't been certificated, and the materials that they've been built from, maybe not what they should be. Many campervan seat beds can be the same. They aren't tested properly, they haven't been fitted properly, but people have never had a problem, and hopefully that they never will. But if they aren't certificated and don't follow the safety sign off and quality checks, how can you be sure? Some will say that the heaters are fine, you just need to change this part and you just need to change that part. Well, okay, but what about the internal parts that you can't access? Should they be changed? Make sure that whatever you're having fitted is compliant, it has been correctly certified and is being correctly. Don't risk a problem that could have been avoided for saving a few quid. Just research, please. Just make sure that you know exactly what you're getting into and you know what the risks are. Let's have a look at some of these systems though that you could have installed, because there are 3 effectively different pathways. It isn't just heaters. You could be choosing an entire climate and comfort system. And this kind of goes back to that earlier question. What temperature are you going to be camping in? If you purely want to heat your camper, then there are some different fuel choices. And let's ignore the wooden stoves at this stage, because it's not really common in leisure vans. They are more often seen in, people who do real van life, not just the leisure vehicles, which most of us are talking about. We've already mentioned the electric. So a few other different options. Well, you've got a gas heater. These heaters are quiet, they're efficient, and they're generally used in campers that have got underslung tanks, like I've mentioned this one has. This has been fitted with one, and it's controlled by this fantastic Savvy Man panel. I really quite like it. The panel shows all your lights, and you can see how much your gas is in your gas tank and things like that. You can set all the heating controls and things. Yeah, it's quite a nice little panel. But the benefit of having that underslung tank is that it saves you space. So whereas you'd normally have a gas bottle if you're just using a gas stove, then you can do away with that gas bottle, and then you've got your underslung tank, and you're just saving a bit of space. Space is critical on a small van like this, so having that gas underslung tank, it does provide a benefit. And the heater that's been installed on this van is a Propex one, and it's from a reputable long-standing brand. But a downside of that is it does have to be fitted professionally, and like I said, some insurance policies could contain conditions which will actually stipulate that, so do be careful with it. Now, secondly, you could have a diesel heater, and this is really, really popular, especially for off-grid, because it just taps into the diesel tank of your van. And like I said, choose the product carefully. I wouldn't hesitate to recommend any brands such as, your Autotherm, your Urbaspec, your Webasto, etc. And I'm sure at this time of year, you're probably going to see a load of YouTube videos about these, where people are saying how amazing they are. And although they may be paid partnerships, I wouldn't be too skeptical, because to be honest with you, like I said, I wouldn't actually have any of those. Yeah, there's probably going to be lots of videos on each of those different brands. So yeah, do have a look at them and find out which is best for you. Each of them are European brands. They've been well made. They've got good warranties, and we know that they've been tested properly as well. And all of them come with a different form of controller. Some of them can just be a turn of the knob controller to proper full-on digital displays with timers. And for camper vans of the VW Transporter size, they are common heaters. But there are other options though. How about a system that can not only heat your van, but can give you hot water as well? These are generally found in the bigger vans like Crafters and Sprinters, your Transits, the bigger Transits and the big transit camper vans and your motorhomes. a Truma Kombi boiler system. You know, that's another well-respected brand in the industry, and it can be dual fuel, and depending on what, you know, you're running, so you can have like a gas and electric, you could have diesel and electric, you know, whatever it is, it can be bought for your needs. But if you don't have room for a Kombi boiler, then there's again more options. You've got the Punban system, and that is actually, again, in this van. You know, it's a water heater which is 12 volt or 240 volt, and they are now being fitted in vans, like I said, such as this. You know, it's perfect for washing up. You obviously use your hobs to cook your food and everything, and then you've got your plates, and then you're washing them up afterwards. You can use hot water or use a shower at the back. You know, it's just a different option. But even again, another option is the Bobil kit. So if you've got that said diesel heater, then you can actually have a diesel heater and attach into this Bobil hot water heater, and then you've got both. You've got a diesel heater and hot water as well. But answering the questions earlier, some of us won't just want our vans to heat. You know, we'll be wanting to cool them as well. Your units that are able to heat and cool are absolutely brilliant, but they're not for everybody, and they're not for all circumstances. You know, options again from brands like Dometic and Truma either can be an internal box unit which is tucked somewhere inside the van, or it could be a roof mounted system. But they are hungry units. They are very, very power hungry. You know, they're designed to run on that 240 volt mains hookup, which is fantastic for an all-season solution for campsites, but they're not really a replacement for diesel or gas heater if you're off-grid. You know, with the ever-improving battery technology and quicker charging systems though, they can be used off-grid, but time is still a little bit limited. You know, you've got to think about things carefully. You don't want to be having your vehicle idling in the middle of the night, you know, to try and keep your batteries topped up. But then again, if you are off-grid and you're in the middle of nowhere, no one's going to hear it, but it's not really going to be good for your engine if you're keeping it running. So there's lots of choice, and not everything is going to be for everybody. You know, if you are that weekend camper and just need to be keeping yourself warm in bed, then that heated sleeping bag or that blanket could be a cheap choice. If you only ever stay on campsites with main power, then a simple electric heater or that air conditioning unit might be a good choice for you, although the latter is a little bit more expensive, well, a lot more expensive. But if you're off-grid and you just need reliable heat, then a diesel heater or a gas heater would likely be your best choice. Just make sure, like I said, you buy a legal one and a certified one. But what would I go for? Well, to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter what I go for, because all our needs are completely different and your needs are different to mine. But if I was getting one, if I had a transporter size van, and if I had the van already, then I'd probably go for the Autoterm, because it's well built, it's well made, you know, it's got a good warranty on it, and it's a good price. But if I was buying a new van, then I'd likely opt for the gas heater, because it's got that underslung tank and it's going to be saving me that interior space. Plus, I've also got the hot water included as well. But then again, if I was buying a crafter size van, I'd be very, very interested in an air conditioning unit, so I could be nice and cool when I'm in the continent in the summer, and then nice and warm in the winter as well. You know, what have you got in your camper, or what are you thinking about getting? Let me know in the comments. If you haven't seen any of my other videos on amazing camper vans, then you can have a look at those here. Thanks for watching, take care, and I hope to see you soon.